There is a dish that has no menu, no presentation, no garnish, no chef who trained in Paris to prepare it. It was born in the darkest corners of Brazilian history, cooked over open fires by people who had nothing, and yet somehow managed to feed entire families with the parts of the animal that everyone else had already thrown away. It is a dish that smells like survival, that tastes like resilience, that carries inside every bowl a history that most people in the world have never been told. Its name is Mocotó, and if you have never heard of it, that is exactly the problem. Because this dish did not just feed the poor families of Brazil, it kept them alive. To understand what Mocotó really is, you first have to understand what it is made of. Because when people hear the ingredients for the first time, especially people who grew up in countries where food comes neatly packaged and pre-cut and completely disconnected from the animal it came from, the reaction is always the same. Disbelief, sometimes disgust, and then, if they are honest with themselves, a kind of quiet awe. Mocotó is made from the feet and leg bones of cattle, the parts that butchers discard, the parts that were considered worthless. The tough, gelatinous, cartilage-heavy lower legs of the cow, boiled for hours and hours until the collagen breaks down, until the marrow releases from inside the bone, until everything that seemed inedible transforms into something thick and rich and deeply nourishing. That is the base. That is where Mocotó begins. Not in a market, not in a supermarket, in the part of the animal that no one wanted. And that, in many ways, is the whole story of this dish. It is a food that was born from rejection, from scarcity, from the necessity of people who had no choice but to find a way to make something from what was left behind, to make nourishment from what the privileged classes had already discarded, to turn bones and cartilage and marrow into a meal that could feed children, that could warm bodies in the cold months, that could give strength to men and women who needed every ounce of energy they could find just to survive another day. Mocotó is not a poor dish because the people who created it lacked imagination or skill. It is a poor dish because the people who created it were given nothing else to work with, and what they did with almost nothing is one of the most remarkable stories in the entire history of Brazilian food. The history of Mocotó cannot be separated from the history of slavery in Brazil. That is a fact that is uncomfortable, and it is a fact that Brazilian food culture has often tried to soften or erase or dress up in more palatable language. But it is the truth. Brazil received more enslaved Africans than any other country in the Americas. More than 4 million people forcibly transported across the ocean, stripped of their names, their languages, their families, and their freedom. These people were put to work on sugar plantations in mines, in cities, in the homes of wealthy families. They were fed what their enslavers did not want: the premium, cuts of meat, the tender pieces, the parts that were considered desirable. Those went to the masters. The enslaved people received the offal, the entrails, the extremities, the feet, the bones. And here is where something extraordinary happened, because instead of simply suffering from this deprivation, the African men and women who were enslaved in Brazil took what they were given and transformed it. They brought with them knowledge, culinary knowledge, cultural knowledge, centuries of understanding about how to cook with very little, how to extract flavor from things that seemed flavorless, how to make fat and collagen and marrow work in ways that European cooking had never considered. They cooked the feet of the cattle slowly and carefully. They added whatever was available: dried beans, cassava flour, local herbs, the small pleasures they could grow or find or trade quietly among themselves. And from those hours of slow cooking, from that refusal to simply accept that what they had been given was worthless, they created something that would outlast the institution that had tried to erase them. Mocotó survived slavery. It survived abolition. It survived the long decades in which Brazilian society tried to pretend that African culinary heritage was not central to the country's identity. It survived poverty and migration and urbanization and every single moment when it would have been easy for this dish to disappear into history. It did not disappear. It held on, because it was too useful, too nourishing, too deeply embedded in the lives of the people who needed it most. When the enslaved populations of Brazil were finally freed in 1888, they were freed into a world that had nothing waiting for them. No land, no resources, no formal education, no safety net. The families who had been enslaved for generations found themselves suddenly free and completely without support, forced into the same poverty that had defined their entire lives under slavery, now simply without the legal designation. They moved to the edges of cities. They built communities in the hillside favelas of Rio de Janeiro, in the crowded peripheries of Sao Paulo, in the dry northeastern interior that the rest of Brazil seemed to have forgotten. And they brought Mocotó with them. In the northeast of Brazil, particularly in states like Bahia, Pernambuco, Maranhão, and Ceará, Mocotó became something essential. The Northeast is a region that has historically suffered from drought, from extreme poverty, from periodic famine. The Sertão, the arid interior of the Northeast, is one of the most economically marginalized regions in all of South America. For the families who lived there, food security was never guaranteed. The years when the rain did not come were years when people died. And in those years, in the periods of scarcity that came with devastating regularity, Mocotó was not a comfort food. It was a lifeline. Cattle feet were cheap, cheaper than any other cut of meat, cheap enough that even families with almost no money could occasionally acquire them, and the nutritional value packed inside those bones was extraordinary. The collagen, the marrow fat, the cartilage that broke down into rich gelatin after hours of cooking. For a family that needed calories and nutrition and the ability to stretch a small amount of food into a meal large enough for 5 or 6 or 7 people, Mocotó was almost a miracle. The preparation of Mocotó in these northeastern communities was not a quick process. This was not fast food. This was not something you made when you had 20 minutes before dinner. Mocotó required time. It required patience. It required the kind of deep knowledge that was passed from mother to daughter, from grandmother to granddaughter, through watching and practicing and tasting and adjusting over years and years of repetition. The feet had to be cleaned thoroughly, scraped and washed and prepared with care because the condition of the ingredients directly determined the quality of the final dish. Then they went into a pot with water and whatever aromatics were available. Dried peppers, garlic, onion, sometimes a small amount of dried meat if the family had any. The pot went over the fire and it stayed there. For hours, sometimes for most of the day, the slow heat did the work that could not be rushed. Breaking down the dense connective tissue, releasing the collagen from the cartilage, drawing the marrow out of the center of the bone until the broth thickened into something that was almost gelatinous, almost glossy, deeply savory and rich in a way that felt completely disproportionate to the simplicity of the ingredients. Near the end of the cooking, beans were often added. In many versions of the dish, the beans are inseparable from the Mocotó itself. They absorb the richness of the bone broth. They add protein and fiber. They transform what would be a simple bone soup into something that could genuinely sustain a working body through an entire day of hard labor. Cassava flour. Farinha, the dry white or yellow flour made from manioc root, was served alongside, because farinha is the great extender of Brazilian poor cooking, the ingredient that can take whatever you have and make it go further, make it stick to your ribs, make it feel like enough when it almost isn't. A bowl of Mocotó with farinha on the side was not just food. It was a calculation. A careful, experienced calculation made by women who understood exactly how much fuel their families needed and exactly how to extract the maximum amount of nourishment from the minimum possible cost. There is something that people who have never been genuinely poor, not temporarily broke, not struggling, but actually poor, the kind of poor that is generational and structural and relentless, do not understand about food made under those conditions. They sometimes look at dishes like Mocotó and see only the poverty. They see the cheapness of the ingredients, and they think that is the whole story. But that is not the story. The story is the knowledge. The story is the skill. The story is the fact that you can take the feet and leg bones of a cow, the parts that were thrown away, the parts that were considered worthless, and through patience and technique and deep culinary understanding, transform them into something that is genuinely, measurably more nourishing than a quick piece of cheap meat would ever be. The women who cooked Mocotó in the Sertão were not making do. They were demonstrating a level of culinary mastery that has taken the rest of the world's food culture decades to begin to appreciate. Because here is what happened next. Here is the part of the story that takes Mocotó from the open fires of the Sertão to the menus of sophisticated restaurants in Sao Paulo. It started slowly, as these things always do. The great migration of northeastern Brazilians to the industrial cities of the south. Sao Paulo above all, which in the middle decades of the 20th century was growing faster than almost any city on earth, brought Mocotó along with everything else that defined northeastern culture. The migrants who came looking for factory work and construction jobs and domestic employment brought their food. They opened small restaurants in the neighborhoods where they settled. They cooked for each other, for their families, for their communities. And Mocotó traveled with them. In Sao Paulo, Mocotó found a new home. The city has always been a place where the food of migrants becomes the food of everyone, where what starts as the private comfort cooking of one community eventually crosses cultural boundaries and becomes part of the larger urban identity. Mocotó made that crossing. By the mid-20th century, there were botecans, small informal bars and restaurants, throughout Sao Paulo's working-class neighborhoods where Mocotó was served on weekend mornings, because the belief was widely held that it was the best possible cure for a hangover. This belief, it turns out, is not without scientific basis. The gelatin and collagen in bone broth are genuinely soothing to the digestive system. The mineral content of the marrow provides real replenishment. The warming, heavy quality of the broth is exactly what a body recovering from a night of drinking needs. Whether people knew the biochemistry or not, they knew from experience that Mocotó worked, and so it became a weekend institution in working-class Sao Paulo. The thing you ate on Saturday morning after Friday night, the thing your father ate, and his father before him. And then, as happens sometimes with the food of the poor when the food is genuinely excellent, something shifted. Chefs started paying attention. Not the chefs who trained in Europe and came back wanting to cook French food in tropical Brazil. The younger generation of Brazilian chefs, the ones who came of age in the 1990s and 2000s, and began to insist that Brazilian cuisine was not just a rough sketch waiting to be refined by foreign technique, but a sophisticated tradition in its own right, deeply rooted and genuinely complex. Those chefs started looking at Mocotó with completely different eyes. They started seeing what the grandmothers in the Sertão had always known, that slow-cooked bone broth is one of the most fundamentally rich and nourishing bases in all of cooking, that the collagen and gelatin extracted from cattle feet give a body and depth to broth that no shortcut can replicate. That Mocotó is not a poor dish that needs to be elevated. It is an excellent dish that the rest of the world had failed to appreciate. It appeared on restaurant menus, first in simple, honest form, because there is no shame in the original, and anyone who pretends there does not understand food. Then in more elaborate preparations, refined and supplemented, but always with the fundamental technique intact, because the technique is the point. The slow cooking is the point. The patience, and the time, and the transformation of something coarse into something extraordinary. That is the whole point of Mocotó, and any chef who understood it knew that the point could not be removed. Food critics wrote about it. Culinary journalists traced its history back through the migrations, back through the Sertão, back through the cities of the Northeast, back to the senzalas where it was first made. Brazilians who had grown up eating it in their grandmother's kitchens found themselves reading about it in magazines and feeling a complicated mixture of pride and something almost like vindication. This food that had been made from what others discarded was now being recognized for what it had always actually been. There is a woman, and she is not a specific person. She is every person. She is the composite of thousands of women across 2 centuries of Brazilian history, who woke before sunrise to start the fire under the pot that held the cattle feet. She had almost nothing. The system she lived in had arranged itself carefully to ensure that she would continue to have almost nothing, but she had knowledge. She had the technique her mother taught her and her mother's mother taught her mother. She had the patience to cook something slowly and correctly because she understood that the slowness was not an inconvenience, but the whole mechanism of the transformation. She had the intelligence to see value in what the powerful had thrown away. She fed her children. She fed her neighbors. She fed generation after generation of families who survived because of what she knew how to do with bones and water and time. Mocotó is the woman's legacy. It is the legacy of the African women who were enslaved and who cooked in the senzalas and who created something from almost nothing that has outlasted every institution that tried to keep them voiceless. It is the legacy of the northeastern families who carried that knowledge through droughts and famines and migrations.
It is the legacy of the migrants who brought it to the cities of the South and kept cooking it in their small apartments and their boutiquins and their weekend morning rituals. And it is now a dish that appears on the menus of restaurants in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro and Recife and Salvador, which is not a contradiction of that legacy but a completion of it. A recognition, finally, that what was made from necessity and kept alive through resilience was, all along, something genuinely extraordinary. The next time you encounter a dish made from the parts that someone else threw away, the feet, the bones, the extremities, the pieces that the privileged world decided were worthless, stop before you react. Because behind every dish like that, behind every food born from scarcity and survival and the refusal to waste what little you have, there is a history. There is knowledge that took generations to develop. There is skill that academia never certified and markets never valued. There is a person who woke up early and started the fire and cooked something slowly and carefully because they understood something profound about nourishment and transformation that the rest of the world is still slowly learning. That history is not a story of poverty. It is a story of intelligence under impossible conditions. It is a story of culture surviving everything that tried to erase it. It is, if you pay attention, one of the most remarkable stories you have ever heard. And it is all there, inside a bowl of Mocotó. Inside the bones and the marrow and the collagen and the slow broth made from the parts of the animal that no one wanted. Made into something extraordinary by people who were told, again and again, that they were worth nothing, and who refused every single time to believe it.